I'm going to be talking about some of the giant skulls that have been found throughout Minnesota. This goes from basically, it comes from a book entitled Earthworks in Minnesota, an abstract from the Aborigines of Minnesota. This is information collected from the late 1800s, as well as just the touch into the early 1900s. So we are going to go over basically in this book. Originally, it was 900 something pages, condensed down to about 350. I'm going to be just touching on the giants. It's much written on the ancient mounds, Indian mounds as well, that are scattered throughout Minnesota in enormous quantities, basically all throughout the state. Um, as we know, though, well, as you may or may not know, there are some spots, if you search the internet, that have already shown that newspaper articles and whatnot where giant skulls were found. As back in the late 1800s, there seemed to be a large search of basically who were these mound builders. So the giants basically that we do know that skeletons, bones were found would be Clearwater, Warren, Dresbeck, Chatfield, Crescent, Sauk Rapids, as well as some bones found in Lake Coronis and Moose Island. Basically, I'm going to go a little more in depth as well as cover many more spots that this book reveals as we continue. So we are going to first touch on the La Crescent group. Basically, I'm going to read exactly what they have written in here. When they opened, they had found to contain human remains of men of large stature. A copper skillet and other trinkets were found at the depth of 18 feet below the surface. Moving on to Dresbeck. Dresbeck is about 5 miles north of La Crescent. It became necessary to remove several of the ancient earth mounds. The skeleton accompanying these specimens was stated by Mr. George B. Dresbeck Jr. and by Mr. Moss to have measured 8 feet in length. This also agrees with a statement made by Colonel George B. Dresbeck concerning the size of a skeleton exhumed several years ago from a mound situated on the high Lone Terrace of the Mississippi near the same place. Moving on to North Branch. With the main river about 2 miles below, actually I'm sorry, below Dresbeck. Human relics discovered on excavating consisted of large human bones. At the foot of Big Stone Lake, at a depth of a foot, he found a solid layer of stones about the size of a man's head. Under that, a few bones, all of very large size. Now, as we read also throughout this entire book, it does speak about basically how they dig up earth mounds and there's nothing in them. That's because the skeletons have basically already turned back into dust. And so, digging up nothing is going to be somewhat standard, as I'll also be reading about how skeletons, how they dig it up, have a full skeleton, then it soon turns to dust. Moving on to Clearwater. According to the Delano Eagle, June 13th, 1878, one of the mounds on the south side of 12 Mile Creek, about 3 miles south of Delano, was explored by a party of young gentlemen. At the depth of 5 feet, they found 2 human skeletons, the size of which indicated sons of Amalek. The bones, in their last stages of decay, one thigh bone measuring 20 inches in length and was proportionally large. The teeth were still round and double all around, though not of large size, but worn flat from long use. Normal size thigh bone or femur, I looked it up, and that average is 18.9 inches. The big thing here, though, is that there is double sets of teeth, as I'm going to be continuing to read, that also are found throughout these giants here in Minnesota as well as many other states. Also, sons of Amalek, as these two guys spoke about, if you actually go back into the Old Testament of the Bible, it does speak about the Amalek. And if you translate that basically into Arabic, um, the it's translated basically as giant or as sons of this tribe of Amalekites. Were known for being unusually tall. They are also called, interpreted as dwellers in the valley, occasionally as warlike, people of prey, cavemen, and also as a people who lick blood. This is basically, as we read through the Old Testament, as commanded to Joshua, David, and whatnot, this tribe needs to be completely destroyed. What I believe with this tribe is after they continued to knock them out all the way through Moses, from Moses to David's day, is they were still in contact with the fallen angels. Now, these giants, as I relate them to, basically going back to Scripture, as the fallen angels came down, mated with women, produced offspring. That's what these giants are. That's what the Nephilim are. And then continue to go through this phase. And as the Bible states, there was Nephilim on those days, and also after, and that was the flood of Noah. And I believe that after the attack of this group, then moving to this group, they had no choice but to make a run for it. You keep getting wiped out. I believe that they then decided to migrate. They came up and across and into this country here, aka the U.S. And as stated by God Himself, I mean, He, with His own words, said that this nation, this people, will be destroyed. So then they come over here thinking they might be safe and sorry, and actually they get knocked out by the Native Americans. As if you do look into it, many cultures of the Native Americans describe running into these giants and how they basically have to slew these giants. Quite amazing. Moving on to Clearwater, though. All right. Mr. R.M. Van Devort gave information concerning the exploration of a mound of this group about the year 1885. It rose 3 feet above the level of the surrounding ground. The opening was at the top, about 3 feet by 6 feet. The material consisted of alternations of ordinary black soil and hard light gray, 4 of the latter, each about 4 inches thick. The bones were about 3 feet from the surface and consisted of 6 skeletons, each skeleton accompanying a space about 18 inches by 30 inches. Leg and arm bones being directly on top of the chest, and the skull on top of all. The bones were generally very brittle, but some were very well preserved. The lower jaw bones were large, the teeth, so far as found, all double, the brow considerably receding backward, thigh bone 22 inches long, remember the ordinary is 18.9, upper arm bone 14 inches long. These bones were taken to Chicago by a doctor some 5 years after they were discovered. This was evidently a regular Sioux burial of bundled bones. So what we're looking at here is probably a movement from one mound to another, as these bundled bones, as I'll also be stating later, are moved from one location to the next and just stacked on top of each other. I'm guessing that was to save space, or maybe there is some significance behind that that I'm unsure of. In the Pioneer Press, June 29th, 1888, is an account of the discovery at 12 miles from Clearwater. Then it gives basically more detailed destination. I'm guessing if you can find one of their maps that they had back in the early 1900s, you'd be able to grab the exact location of these places, as they have, for instance, Northeast 1/4 Section 21T 121-27. And then you'd be able to find exactly where that is. This is by Charles Pinkerton, the town of Coronia. The remains of 7 persons said to have been 7 to 8 feet high. They were found in a kind of mound and were buried with their heads down. The skulls indicated an inferior race of men. The teeth and the jawbones were mostly sound and not like the teeth of the present race of men. Right there is one that, looking on the internet, that we are already familiar with. In the Pioneer Press, July 1st, 1888, was published a more satisfactory and correct account of this discovery, abstracted as follows. The mound itself is about 50 feet across and some 12 feet high, of symmetrical shape. According to Professor H.F. Hatchtrib, who visited the place and examined the bones, the skeletons were not of unusual size. Remember, they said that they were 7 to 8 feet high. They were deposited in the mound in sitting position facing the lake. The skulls, when compared with Indian skulls in the possession of Dr. Thomas S. Roberts of Minneapolis, showed some marked differences. The forehead was very low and the brow prominent. The posterior anterior axis of the skull was very long. Judging from the external auditory meatus, this prehistoric man had a large ear. His jaws were heavy, his cheekbones prominent. The ridges of his arm bones indicated he was very muscular. His front teeth, instead of being chisel-shaped like those of modern man, had their greater diameter at right angles to the jawbone, and all his teeth were quite large, and some of the enamel perfectly preserved. On the whole, the skull seemed to be quite small in proportion to the rest of the skeleton. The remains were evidently those of ancient mound builders. The mounds were covered with a forest of large elms and maples. Right there, for instance, getting examined later, as I'm going to be covering also 2 more times. Basically, these giant skeletons that are found all of a sudden aren't so giant anymore, as we'll be covering that coming up. Moving on to the next area that we are looking at. Alright, this is Gideon's Mound, Lake Minnetonka area. Let's see here. Mound number 7, open, afforded 30 skulls. 1 large skull, which was cloven from front to back, apparently with 1 blow, has the notebook memorandum made by Mr. Lewis. 9.5 length, 6.5 diameter, 7 inches base. So basically, I had to look this up and then translate it from centimeters to inches on the internet. Lengthwise, it is a little bit longer, as the average is 21 to 22. This was 24.13 inches. Looking then at the diameter, we are looking at 17 to 18 inches average. This is 16.5 inches basically wide. So what you're looking at is a longer skull and thinner. Kind of like some of those that you see. I know some of the South American people where they push their skulls to make it long on purpose, as I believe they believe some of their gods or whatnot follow. We also see evidence of other skulls around the world being found like this. In the Minnesota Historical Collections, Volume 2, page 220, Mr. J.H. Pond in writing The Dakota Gods. This is, I'm actually going to be going into a few other things I found kind of interesting. This one basically talks about a hill that is known to the Dakotas as the Taku-Wakan-Tipi, the dwelling place of the gods. It is believed that one of the family of divinities, the Anunnaki, dwells there. Finding this quite interesting, and basically being up by Lake Minnetonka, I kind of scoped this place out. I did a little further research on it, on how basically their god went back and forth through Coldwater Creek from the top of the hilltop down to the water, like in the underground water system, since no one seems to know where Coldwater Creek originates from. That is one of their beliefs, the Dakota Indians here. I went there. I didn't find anything too amazing other than the human skull. Oh, human skull. I'm sorry. Basically, the stone that looks like a face. I found this quite interesting, to say the least, as I was kind of traveled down the hill all the way down to the Mississippi to, I guess, check out the situation down there. Moving on, also, then basically 4 miles above this talks then about man and elephant were here temporarily at the falls. The tusks and teeth of one of the bones of the other the tusks and teeth of the one and the bones of the other have been discovered in the same character of drift. Basically, that's talking about what this next one is also going to be talking about, the discover of mastodons. One there, basically by Minnetonka Falls, Minnehaha Falls. And then we also have another one, the discovery of remains of the mastodon at Stillwater. And that talks about this being found then after the glacier moved away, and so on. Alright, then we are looking into one that I believe is also Stillwater, the town site of Vesa in 1855. This is military, the mound was near Military Road opposite the Russell House. A few days since about half this mound was removed and a large human skeleton was found lying with the head towards the east, about 8 feet above the level of the surrounding prairie and about 4 feet below the top of the mounds. The bones were quite perfect when first exposed, but soon crumbled. Alright, then we are looking at Fish Lake Mounds near Stark. One of these mounds was opened in 1869 by Mr. George Lynch, who found one skeleton of more than ordinary size. Then moved to Hoffman. Here, 3 similar bone bundles were encountered, accompanied by 3 skulls. The bones were more rotted than those in Mound 25. The skulls appeared to be distinctly low-browed and Neanderthal. So that goes back to then the ancient, I guess you could say, mound builders. I found that interesting, just as they were calling them Neanderthals. Alright, then we move to near Painesville. According to the St. Paul Globe, August 12th, 1896, a hatchet-shaped stone object was plowed up on the farm of Homer Beckley near Lake Coronis. It weighed about 3 pounds. In the immediate vicinity, from time to time, numerous stone arrowheads have been found, and in a mound not far from Mr. Beckley's farm, the skeleton of a huge man was exhumed. Moving on to near Moose Island Lakes. Mr. Hill remarks, on being excavated, this mound disclosed many human bones, the owners of which must have been 7 foot high. Alright, then we are going to Pine City. Captain Sod, a Chippewa about 100 years old, says that after a battle with the Sioux, some of them were buried in this mound, one being a very large man. This was an intrusive burial, the mound having been built at a much earlier date. In its removal, several skeletons were exhumed, some being found in erect position and one of gigantic size. Alright, then we are going to Marshall. The following is condensed from the Pioneer Press, May 23rd, 1882. Mound located near Warren, Marshall County, exhumed by Han J.P. Nelson, was located on Panbina Trail, was about 60 feet by 12 feet. On examination, it was found to contain near the center the bones of more than 10 persons, male and female. Mingled with them the bones of badgers, horses, and dogs. The skull was the only specimen that did not crumble on exposure to the air. Their size indicated gigantic stature for their owners. The skull is not particularly striking, except that the mark of the hairline remains and shows that the forehead little was possessed. At the base of the skull is a protuberant formation which may have been peculiar to the race or the individual. The breadth between the temporal bones is about the same as an average Caucasian, but the dome is more ridge-like and contains less gravity for gray matter. Once again, there is one of those people with the long skulls that you see in some pictures. Alright, then moving on to basically the granddaddy. This is the Grand Mound, which is located up north, almost near Canada. International Falls, about 20 miles west of that, is this Grand Mound. Basically, they're stating that it was built, as I look at the websites on it today, it was built by the Laurel Indians, which, when you have a group of people that are basically giants you pull out of there, you're going to wonder, well, how do we cover these guys up? Well, let's just call them some Native Americans and give them a specific Indian name. In this book, it states that it was at least 800 years old. The current website on basically the Grand Mound states that it can be as old as 200 BC. Now, there is, I believe, 5 different mounds in this location. One of them, they found one very large skull. And then we basically, it talks over for a few pages on this, the ways that they went around digging and whatnot. And then you get to the meat of it here. The work lasted about 3 weeks. They estimated that they found more than 100 skeletons, all of which were adjusted together on the grass and photographed. Those pictures were never developed. The bones indicated very large men, the largest being estimated at over 10 foot. It appeared to Mrs. or Misters Hulbert and Kempton that the succession of burials and the differences in the preservation warranted the conclusion that 2 different tribes of aborigines were represented. An earlier tribe had dwelt there for a long time, burying their dead first. They were attacked by a hostile tribe of larger men who were supplied with copper weapons and implements. The older remains were associated with ancient pottery, some of the artistically engraved stone axes, knives, and spears, bone beads, the last being still held by a thong which resembled buckskin. So right there, I mean, you've got 100 bodies laid out on the ground of all very large men, as it states, over 10 foot. Pictures never developed. Moving on to a different mound that is basically in the same vicinity. Mr. U.M. Thomas also given an account of this exploration. It is found in the St. Paul Dispatch, November 26, 1896, accompanied by a little sketch map of the Rainy River Valley. The map shows 7 mounds, 1 at the outlet of Rainy Lake on the north side of the river, 2 at McKinsey Farm, 1 on the north side of the river about halfway between the Little Fork and the Bowstring, 1 at the mouth of the Bowstring, and 2 on the north side of the river, a few miles below the mouth of the Black River. Okay, I guess that didn't give me where I was looking for. Okay, here we go. Only 1 complete skeleton was secured, and that was one of a giant 9 foot tall. All the large bones were secured and put in place. The whole carefully packed in moss and placed in a box and removed to a place of security. So let's see what this place of security is. in the St. Paul Globe, February 14th, 1897, in further reference to this mound and its contents, from which is learned that the giant skeleton, referred to by others, was sent to St. Paul and was examined by two interested gentlemen, and that's in quotes, mind you, and was pronounced to be not more than 5 foot 10 inches in height, of robust proportions, and probably the remains of an intrusive and recent internment by the Ojibwa Indians. Right there, 5 foot 10 inches. Other place in this book, it talks about the normal size of people being 5 inches 10 or 5'10" to 6'2". So these people are not going to obviously waste their time with a normal skeleton. And right there is basically the mounds, the skeletons, the giants that were discussed in this book, Earthworks in Minnesota, at the time of basically the digging up, as much of, I guess, moving into this area was happening. Also wondering who are these mound builders. Obviously, there are Indian tribes that bury their dead in these mounds, as well as other things. There was found multiple things of pottery and whatnot also buried in these. But I believe this also goes back to the giants of the Bible and how they migrated over here into our country. Thank you for listening. Scattered throughout Minnesota in enormous quantities, basically all throughout the state. As we know, though, well, as you may or may not know, there are some spots, if you search the internet, that have already shown that newspaper articles and whatnot where giant skulls were found. As back in the late 1800s, there seemed to be a large search of basically who were these mound builders. So the giants basically that we do know that skeletons, bones were found would be Clearwater, Warren, Dresbeck, Chatfield, Crescent, Sauk Rapids. At the foot of Big Stone Lake, at a depth of a foot, he found a solid layer of stones about the size of a man's head. Under that, a few bones, all of very large size. Now, as we read also throughout this entire book, it does speak about basically how they dig up earth mounds and there's nothing in them. That's because the skeletons have basically already turned back into dust. And so, you know, digging up nothing is going to be somewhat standard, as I'll also be reading about how skeletons, how they dig it up, have a full skeleton, then it soon turns to dust. Moving on to the skeleton accompanying these specimens was stated by Mr. George B. Dresbeck Jr. and by Mr. Moss to have measured 8 feet in length. This also agrees with a statement made by Colonel George B. Dresbeck concerning the size of a skeleton exhumed several years ago from a mound situated on the high Lone Terrace of the Mississippi near the same place. Moving on to North Branch, with the main river about 2 miles below, below Dresbeck. Human relics discovered on excavating consisted of large human bones, as well as some bones found in Lake Coronis and Moose Island. Basically, I'm going to go a little more in depth, as well as cover many more spots that this book reveals as we continue. So we are going to first touch on the Le Crescent group. Basically, I'm going to read exactly what they have written in here. When they opened, they had found to contain human remains of men of large stature. A copper skillet and other trinkets were found at the depth of 18 feet below the surface. Moving on to Dresbeck. Dresbeck is about 5 miles north of Le Crescent. It became necessary to remove several of the ancient earth mounds I'm going to be talking about some of the giant skulls that have been found throughout Minnesota. This goes from, basically it comes from a book entitled Earthworks in Minnesota, an abstract from the Aborigines of Minnesota. This is information collected from the late 1800s, as well as just the touch into the early 1900s. So we are going to go over, basically in this book, originally it was 900 something pages, condensed down to about 350. I'm going to be just touching on the giants. It's much written on the ancient mounds, Indian mounds as well, that are